The publisher location is no longer included in the reference. The publisher, in this example, Simon & Schuster, is placed right after the book title without including the city and state New York. Number 2. The in-text citation for works with 3 or more authors is now shortened right from the first citation using et al. In the 6th edition, sources with 3, 4, or 5 authors were given in full the first time the source was mentioned. Number 3. You should include surnames and initials for up to 20 authors in the reference list. In the 6th edition, it was up to 7. Number 4. The label DOI: is no longer necessary. DOIs are now formatted as URLs. Number 5. You no longer need to write retrieve from in front of the URL unless a retrieval date is needed. You now also include the website name unless it's the same as the author. Number 6. For ebooks, the format, platform, or device, for example, Kindle, is no longer included in the reference. Number 7. Clear guidelines are provided for including contributors other than authors and editors. For example, if you want to cite this video, make sure to include Scribber as the author. Number 8. Dozens of examples are included for online source types such as podcast episodes, YouTube videos, and social media posts. The 7th edition of the APA Publication Manual includes guidelines on inclusive and bias-free language for topics such as gender, age, disability, racial and ethnic identity, and sexual orientation. Number 9. The singular they or their is endorsed as a gender-neutral pronoun. Instead of saying he or she, you're encouraged to say they. Number 10. Instead of using adjectives as nouns to label groups of people, descriptive phrases are preferred. So instead of saying the poor, you should say people living in poverty. Number 11. Instead of broad categories, you should use exact age ranges that are more relevant and specific. So use people in the age range of 65 to 75 years old instead of over 65. The APA also provided different paper format guidelines for professional and student papers. You can find a sample paper for both types in the manual. Some of the format changes include number 12, increased flexibility regarding fonts. Options include Calibri 11, Arial 11, Lucida Sans Unicode 10, Times New Roman 12, and Georgia 11. Number 13. The running head on the title page no longer includes the word running head. It now contains only a page number and the paper title. Number 14. The running head is omitted in student papers, unless your instructor tells you otherwise. Number 15. Heading levels 3 to 5 are updated to improve readability. For level 3, instead of indenting, it's now flush left and also italicized. Level 4 headings are no longer italicized. A level 5 heading is now bolded. In terms of style, not much has changed, but there are 2 changes you should know about. Number 16. Use only one space after a period at the end of the sentence. Number 17. Use double quotation marks to refer to linguistics examples instead of italics.
All right, so that was a quick overview, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of these things that she's already mentioned in the video. Nope, where did that? All right, so here's where we're going to do some highlights from the manual. And I believe Gavin is recording this so that he can send it probably afterwards. So if you don't have to write a bunch of notes because you'll have access to all this. So chapter 2 talks about the paper elements in the format. And so you heard in the video that only the page number is needed, which is in the upper right corner. The title page does equal page 1. The only time that this will differ, the only time that you'll not follow this is if your instructor tells you otherwise. But APA 7, the only thing that's needed in the header is the page number. The fonts used, as long as you use the same font throughout, you're good to go. So just make sure that that's consistent. And then line spacing, everything is double spaced. There are no blank lines before or after headings. That's one of the things that I see a lot, or saw a lot when I was editing papers, is that sometimes your Word document or your software just wants to add extra lines for whatever reason. Just make sure those are all set correctly so that there are no blank lines before and after headings. Other things from chapter 2, the video had already gone through some of these things, the headings, the formatting for the levels. And this is important, especially for levels 1 through 3. If you are able to set your Word document in a way that you can set the styles, it will automatically generate your table of contents at the very end. So this is something that you will want to learn, and to make sure that you have the correct levels in there. Chapter 4 talks about writing style and grammar. So one of the things as you are writing, especially if it's taking some time or maybe writing is not one of your strengths, is the first thing is to think concise. So don't use more words than necessary. There's no reason to use jargon. Instead of using like as well as, simply use and. Instead of within, just use in. Instead of using utilize, just use, right? So don't use more words than necessary. Think about how do you write that in a very concise format. And then also don't be redundant. So a sum total, that's redundant because a sum does mean the total. Same thing with absolutely essential. If it's absolute, then it's essential. Pick one or the other. There's no need to use both. Another thing to think about is that you have to explain everything. And so for me personally, I think this was one of the most challenging parts where I felt like, I don't know how to put it in a positive manner, but I felt like there was something wrong with me having to explain everything. But the thing that really helped me was to know that not everybody knew what I knew, right? So the more that you're getting into your research, the more you need to understand that people don't know what you know because they haven't read the same things that you've read. They haven't researched the same things that you've researched. So assume that you just have to explain everything. Even if internally you might feel that it's really silly that you're doing that, but know that people don't know exactly what it is that you're talking about unless you lay it out for them and provide them with that context. So in that, avoid contractions, right? So write out cannot versus can't, or have not versus haven't, and avoid colloquialisms because those are too informal, and also because it really diversifies the meaning that you're trying to give it. And so, for example, one of the things that I think we talk a lot about in higher ed is diving in deeper. To somebody who is not a native English speaker, that doesn't make any sense. What do you mean dive deeper? Are you telling me to dive into a pool and go deeper? Like, what does that mean? And so colloquialisms, jargon, anything that even within that field, you want to avoid doing that. Because also jargon and colloquialisms, they change over time, right? So 20 years ago, I don't know if 20 years ago they had diving deeper, but I would imagine 20 years from now, it's going to be a little different. 20 years ago, they didn't have the word quarantining. We apparently now have that word, but 20 years from now, are they still going to have that word? I don't know. So just think about how do you keep it simple, and how do you just make sure you're explaining everything? This next one, which is avoiding anthropomorphism, it's a really, really big word. And it's one thing that I saw time and time again when I was editing papers. And it's really giving inanimate objects human characteristics. So for example, in the manual, it gives one example of pairs of rats versus rat couples, right? Because rats don't come in couples. There's a pair of rats, not rat couples. The other thing also is giving inanimate objects. If you are quoting or referring to an author and what the person said, make sure you write the author's name, not that the book said, because technically the book can't say anything, but a person can, right? So one of the ways to avoid anthropomorphism is to think about, can a person do that or can they not? If a person can do that, then write the person did that, versus a theory concluded. Technically, a theory can't conclude anything. A person can conclude, but a theory cannot conclude. Does that make sense? Okay. More in chapter 4, I think active, not passive. So active voice is someone or something is doing the action, versus passive voice, which is something being done to someone or something. In my cohort, one of the things that we ended up, I guess it was sort of an inside joke, but one of my classmates had said, if it could be done by zombies, if you can add by zombies at the end and that makes sense, most likely that means that it's passive and not active. The general rule for APA is to use more active voice than passive voice. And active voice also helps you to avoid dangling modifiers. What's a dangling modifier? Well, it's something that isn't, probably better to give you an example. So if you start off a sentence by saying, um, going by that school, and then you keep going, it's like, well, who went by that school? What does that mean? You wrote something out there, you described something, but you didn't really give it a subject to that action. But if you write it in an active voice, then it's a lot simpler, right? So like, I went by that school, or that person did such and such. So you want to think active, not passive, in that. Think I, me, he or him, or she or her, or they or them, versus we, us, you, right? So first person plural pronouns, avoid those unless you are writing a paper with more than one person in addition to you. And don't write in second person pronouns, like the you and the yours, because that's informal and not something that's suitable for academic writing, right? So each pronoun should refer clearly to its antecedent, so what it's actually referring to. If you're writing and all of a sudden you're just saying that they did this, but you didn't really describe who they is, it's going to be really difficult for the reader to follow along with what you're talking about. You can use him or her if you know the preferred pronouns. Obviously use they or them if you are not certain about the pronouns. And then the other thing is to think about agreement. So data, as much as it might sound weird in a sentence, data is actually a plural word. So the verb should be plural. So it will be data were or data are versus data is or data was. Also, organizations are single. NEC has a great program. It has fill in the blank. It would be incorrect to say NEC has a great program. They have, because it's a single organization, not plural. Again, that's something that I saw when I was editing a lot of papers. Chapter 6 gives the overview of the mechanics of style. So for example, spacing is only one space after most punctuations at the end of a sentence. After commas, semicolons, colons, periods that follow initials in names, there's always one space. However, there is no space after internal periods in abbreviations or around colons and ratios. Then there's this thing called an Oxford comma, which is basically if you have a series of 3 or more items that you put a comma before the conjunction. So you'll see here in this example, the day was hot, sunny, comma, and humid. So anytime there's 3 or more items in a list, you're going to put in that comma, and that comma is called an Oxford comma. But that is something that if you work with an editor, they will catch, or they should catch for you, just in case. And then quotation marks, you place commas and periods inside closing quotation marks. All other punctuation marks should be outside the closing quotation marks, unless it's part of the actual quote. So if a quote actually ends in a question mark, you put that in the quotes. If it doesn't, then you leave it outside. Hyphens. One of the things that will look weird only because Word kind of shows you that it's maybe incorrect, is that most words are formed with prefixes and suffixes do not need to be hyphened. So some of these words like subpopulation, extracurricular, those for the most part, they'll be fine in a Word document. But words such as post-test, anti-deficit, those who probably get that little red squiggly line that tells you that it's spelled incorrectly. But APA, there actually aren't that many words that will require hyphens in APA. And you can see page 164 in the manual if you wanted more specific examples of those. But for the most part, when you're using the prefixes of sub, extra, pre, post, multi, most likely it will not have a hyphen needed for those words. Capitalization. You want to capitalize a job title or position when the title actually precedes the name. So if you're talking about Gavin, you're saying Professor Henning, the P is capitalized. However, if it is a job title or position that follows a person's name, it's not. So in the example, Henning, comma, director of the doctoral program, that would not be capitalized. The other thing also, you capitalize nouns that are paired with a number because they then form a label or a title. So chapter 4, question 3, participant 10, however you write when it comes to those things, if you're going to turn it into sort of a label or a title, then that noun is capitalized throughout the entire paper. Whenever you hear or read about needing to write an entitled case, title case just means you need to capitalize most of the major words. And so those are going to include all nouns, all verbs, all adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, all words of 4 letters or more. So that's a lot that you're capitalizing. But I wrote all those times when they need to be capitalized because I think pronouns, we don't always think that they need to be capitalized. And verbs, even like, a short verb like is, sometimes we feel like we don't need to, but those should all be capitalized. And then whenever you're hearing sentence case, just know that most words are lowercase. So that should really be like the first letter of that sentence will be capitalized, everything else will be lowercase, unless it's a proper noun. Some more things out of chapter 6. So abbreviations. This is a big thing that I saw in papers that I edited, was that they should only be used if they're mentioned at least 3 times in the paper. So if you go through your paper and all of a sudden you see that you've only mentioned it twice, there really is no need to mention it because it's more work for the reader to go back to find what it is that that abbreviation stands for. So you want to introduce the abbreviation at the first mention and then use the abbreviation only after the introduction. So once you've introduced it, you stick straight, you strictly stick with the abbreviation throughout the rest of that. When you are writing or setting up the tables and figures, you want to make sure you do define abbreviations during those within each table or figure. For numbers that are less than 10, the numbers should be written out as words. All numbers 10 and above should be written as numerals, right? So 12, 13, 25, all those should be written in numbers unless they start a sentence. If they start a sentence, then you have to write it out. Numbers that are used to represent time, dates, ages, scores and points on a scale, exact sums of money, numerals as numerals, these should all be written as numerals. So for example, if you're saying 3 hours, 5 times, 6 years old, those should all be written in the numerals versus writing it out. Chapter 7 talks about tables and figures. And one of the important things to realize is that as much as, for me, one of the hardest things that I had to learn was that tables and figures weren't really there for my own pleasure of just making it look pretty. APA is actually pretty specific on how you set up a table, how you set up a figure, why you would even use that, because they are only used to provide additional information. They are not to repeat information. So in the narrative of your paper, you have talked about what's in the table or what's laid out, or you've explained what it is that you're trying to explain. If you've done that, then there's really is no reason for a table or a figure because it should not repeat what you've already talked about. If you do have a table or a figure, you want to make sure that you call out every table and every figure in the text. So that could look like in parentheses after a certain paragraph, see table 3 or see figure 1, just so that you refers the reader for more information if they choose to go to that table or figure. You want to avoid colors and shading on tables unless there's a specific reason for doing so. And if there is a specific reason, then you want to make sure that you put that in the notes. When you're setting up tables and figures, the table or the figure number, they are bolded. The title of the table or the figure is only italicized, not bolded. Chapter 8 talks about in-text citations. General rule, paraphrases and direct quotes will require in-text citations. So if you are using material from somebody else that is sort of adding to your argument or that referring to what you're talking about, you want to make sure you provide a citation for that. And that's definitely important to give credit where credit is due. For basic in-text citation styles, you can go to page 266 of the manual. And the video sort of talked about this a little bit where, depending upon the number of authors, what the parenthetical citation will look like, what the narrative citation would look like. So just know 3 or more authors, you would already be abbreviated in this manner. More on chapter 8, if you look at page 267, this is a change from APA 6. If the first authors of multiple references share the same surname but have different initials, you need to include the first author's initials in all in-text citations, even if the year of publication differs. So in APA 6, if the year of publication differed, you didn't have to worry about it. But in APA 7, to make sure that it's clear, you want to make sure that the first author's initials in all in-text citations are included. So this is only if they have the same last names that you're working with. Direct quotes with less than 40 words, they should be enclosed by quotation marks followed by a parenthetical citation that also includes the page number. At the end of that citation is where you put the period. For a direct quote with 40 or more words, those are called block quotes, and you don't use quotation marks for those. Those start on a new line, they're indented. Actually, the entire paragraph is indented. And at the end of that quotation, you put the period and then the parenthetical citation. There's no period after that closing parentheses. Chapter 9 talks about a bunch of just reference lists. So in general, all citations need a corresponding entry in the reference list. So the only time that does not need to happen is if you are using a personal communication, because there's no access for a reader to gain access to that person that you just talked to, right? So there's no need to put that in the reference list. But anything else, if you are even referencing it, citing it one time in the paper, it has to be included in the reference list at the end. You want to list out all authors up to and including 20 authors. In APA 6, that threshold was a lot lower. APA 7, it's up to 20 authors. Journals and book titles are italicized and they're written in title case. And you want to list all entries alphabetically by the first author's last name. If the multiple sources by the same authors, then you want to list the entries chronologically with the most recent at the end. So you would start with, whoever, and then 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, chronologically that way. And as the video had talked about, most entries should end with a DOI or a URL. DOI is Digital Object Identifier, or a URL, and the hyperlinks should be active. So that means that you do not want to end with a period, because that could mess with the ability to access that link. Chapter 10 gives you a bunch of reference examples. And so what I've done for the next few slides is pull out different ones that you will probably cite most often, and how do you actually write those reference entries at the end. So this is an example of a journal article, which I'm sure you will read a lot of. But I've broken it down to each one of these. So for example, the authors, right? So those are the authors right there. Every period and comma that I've put in here is actually really important, because those all do matter. So the authors, you have them out there, is always the last name first, and then first initial, period, space, middle initial if they have one. Year of publication is always in parentheses. The title of the article, which is written in sentence case. So again, sentence case, most often the first letter is capitalized, and that's the only one that's capitalized. Any letters that are after a colon, that is also capitalized as well, which is why you see the A capitalized here. The title of the journal is always italicized, and it's always written in title case. That comma after it is not italicized. It's followed by the volume number, which is italicized. The issue number, which is enclosed in parentheses. In APA 6, there was no need to put the issue number if the volume was paginated. In APA 7, issue numbers are required. So if you can find one, you should put it in there. The page range, followed by a period, and then the DOI, which is written in this format. Another one that you'll most likely use is a book. So in this case, again, the author, last name, comma, first initial, period. Year of publication is in parentheses, followed by a period. The title of the book is italicized. And notice that it is in sentence case, not title case. And then all that's needed after that is the publisher, followed by a period. A chapter in an edited book. So very similar to what we've done so far. You have the authors, you have the year of publication, you have the title of the article written in sentence case, the name of the editor. If there was more than one editor here, you would put the ampersand and then followed by the first initial, last name. And then there will be an S here. It will be EDS period. Name of the edited book is italicized, again in sentence case, followed by the edition number, the page range, and the name of the publisher. Another reference example is annual reports. In this case, it would be the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, that wrote this article, or this report, year of publication, title of the report, and then the URL. Again, there is no period after the URL to make sure that the hyperlink is active. And sometimes you'll probably also be citing or referencing dissertations or theses. Again, fairly similar to what we've been going through so far. So you have the author, the year of publication, the title of the paper, all written in sentence case. You'll notice that here, because Milgram is a proper noun, that's capitalized. The publication number, which you could find on the paper itself. And then in brackets, you want the doctoral dissertation, the word doctoral dissertation, or a master's thesis, whichever one it is, and the name of the institution that's awarding the degree, and then the source. So in this case, it's ProQuest Dissertations and Thesis Global. Sometimes you probably use online videos as well, so you want to cite those. In this case, the author. Here you'll see the date is slightly different. It's not just the year, but it's also the month and the day, which you can find in just about any video that's been posted. The title of the video is italicized. The type of the media, that needs to be in brackets. The platform that's used, and then the URL.
Quick question. Would
Yes.
that be the same for our webinars considered a video?
Yes, they can be. Mhm.
Or do you just put webinar?
Yep.
In, okay.
And then just some helpful things. This is the last slide, and then I'll open up for more questions. Is one of the things that I've learned, especially with any kind of paper, is writing an outline is actually really important and really helpful. I remember the first time that Gavin had asked my outline, and I didn't have one, and I was kind of like, I don't know. But the more that I worked with it, the more that I realized that if you can do a really good outline, that not only does it help you link your arguments together, but you've essentially written your paper from that. The other thing also is, if you are reading an article and you can't find the DOI, here are two really, really good links that you can use. The first one is probably the one that I use most often. You go to that link and you basically just type in the name of the article, and it'll come up with a bunch of things where it has the author's name, the volume number, the issue, like all the information that you will ever need to complete the reference entry. And then the only thing I was just sort of end with is user resources. And so we had talked about Heartful Editor, and let me just stop sharing for a second. And one of the things that I learned is that if I could put in all the work at the front end, then the writing at the back end is not that hard. Oh, and Gavin's already found perfect an example for that. Oh, and I had no idea that you all had asked questions in this. Sorry.
So if you don't have the manual already, my suggestion is the online version, because you can search that. If you have the hard copy, you can do bookmarks, but in the online version, you can search really quickly. So that's how I found the webinar. I just went and typed search webinar, came up in a second.
There you go. Duana, for your clarification question, you do not spell it out the first time. So at the first use, you would use that abbreviation with a period at the end of AL.
All right, great. Thank you.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
that's what's different from in 6. You include all of them on the first citation.
Yep.
But in 7, they changed that.
Let's see if there's any other questions.
No, I think we were just saying parts to bookmark. I don't think there are any other questions.
Oh, okay. Any questions or comments?
This is helpful. Thank you.
Good, I'm glad. And it really, we talked about Hartful Editor. So one of the things that, I started out with Hartful Editor before it was really Hartful Editor, I think. Gavin, when I first started the program, he invited the founder and editor-in-chief, Sarah Henry, to do a 2-hour seminar with us. And most of us sat in that 2-hour seminar, kind of looked at each other and was like, why do we need to know these things? And she went through every little thing. At that point in time, I just figured, you know what? I am just going to use her as a resource as much as I can. So I really started hiring her as my editor from the very first paper that I had. And then once I got used to it, the end was a lot easier. If you were to ask some of my classmates and probably Sarah, because she's been doing this for a long time, if you don't put in the work now, it's going to cost more at the end, because you will want to hire an editor at the end of your dissertation. You're going to want to do that because they're going to catch all the little things that you've missed. They're going to help you with your writing. They're going to make sure that things are flowing. If you wait until the very end, chances are it's going to cost probably thousands of dollars, in all honesty, versus getting it in the front end and just learning how to do it and do it for yourself, so that when the editor actually reads it, they're just doing some of the little things that you've missed. I'm really grateful that I did use Hartful Editor at the very beginning. Again, this is probably before she incorporated the business, but once you get that, sorry, let me switch gears for a bit. As a freelance editor for Hartful Editor, one of the things that we were instructed, encouraged, and what we did was that any comments that we made was not to tear any of the students down. We've heard horror stories of some professors or even some editing companies that basically went back to the student and was like, you can't write. I don't know why you're even in this program. Hartful Editor is not like that whatsoever. One of the things that we will do, I keep saying we as in like I'm still part of it, which I guess I can always go back. But one of the things that Hartful Editors will do is that they'll go back and they'll teach you, right? So as you're writing, they'll say, you know what, you need an Oxford comma because this is what the APA manual says. Or they'll say, on page such and such in the manual, this is what it says. This is why we're correcting it this way. They'll probably do it 2 or 3 times. And after that, it's like, okay, we've told you now how to do it. Now you want to go and do it, as opposed to correcting it for you. Really, because 1, you learn, and 2, it takes time when the editors have to correct every single mistake. So that's another big thing. And then also you can always ask questions, right? Like when I was editing for them actively, a lot of times students just reach out and say, well, how do I just do this? No problem. Quick response, send it right back. So you know how to do it, where you can find it. There's also been some times where there's been some contentions between the editor and maybe the committee, because sometimes the professors and the committees think that they know APA. They might know the research and they may be familiar with the research, but they may not be familiar with APA and how much has changed. And so we don't go head to head with the committee members. If the committees are saying, if the chairs are saying that this is what they want, we will comply with what the chair wants or what the student wants. But we'll also make it clear that in the APA manual, this is what it says. Whenever there's a difference, as you go into the dissertation phase, whenever there's any difference between the campus guidelines and APA, always follow the campus guidelines, because that's also what Hartful Editor will always refer to. So I know you all are probably not at the research phase part of your dissertation, but know that at the end, when you're doing your research, one of the things that that you will also always submit to your editor is the campus guidelines. If you decide not to go with Hartful Editor and you go with somebody else, but they don't ask you for your campus guidelines, I would run fast and go find somebody else, because it's going to require you more work on the end of that. Thanks, Dwayna, for coming out.
Our guidelines for the dissertation are very, very similar to APA. There's some that are a little bit different that we actually changed to make it easier. It's mainly around pagination and formatting and titles. That's the biggest difference. Casey, what are the top 5 errors you see most often?
Top 5 errors that I see most often. 1, I would say anthropomorphism. To the point now when I read stuff, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that thing can't do what you're saying it can do. So that's a big one. Yeah, like write easily, right? Like make sure that people can understand it and think, can a human person do that? Or can a thing actually do that, right? Like theories cannot conclude. I've heard that way too often, and theories just can't. Another one would be the numbers thing. I think sometimes people get that confused and they don't know, do they write the number out? Do they not write the number? How do you do that? Because even one of the things that kind of messed me up with this APA 7 is that I'm so accustomed to seeing first year students as written out, right? Like first -year students. In APA 7, it's actually not written that way, which still blows my mind. It's number 1 ST-year student, because it's an ordinal number. So even ordinal numbers are written as numbers now. They're not written out, which I think is so crazy. So that's one thing. Another thing, like the numbers thing, is something that you kind of wrap your head around, right? So if you need more clarity in that, go to the APA manual for the numbers. I would say commas is another big thing, because if you go from, I think it's MLA does not require a comma before the conjunction, which in my undergrad, it was MLA that I wrote in. APA, there's the Oxford comma. I remember the first time Sarah was like, an Oxford comma. I'm like, Oxford what? Like, I know what a comma is. I don't know what an Oxford comma is. And so that was a learning thing for me as well. That'll be 3. Number 4, something else that I've seen a lot happen in the dangling modifiers. Oftentimes, I think is the way that we talk. So one of the things that you'll learn as you're writing more academically is that you can't always write the way you talk, because when we talk it's very informal, and then when you write it's like, oh, I have to like be more formal. And so the dangling modifiers, especially when you put a comma and then you start describing another activity, right? So like, so for example, I went to the store, comma, seeing the box on the shelf, and it's like, who saw the box on the shelf? What's the box doing? And as much as I think colloquially we understand what that means, academically when you read a paper you're like, I don't know who walked in or who saw the box, and why does that matter? Like, you need to make that link for your readers. And so the dangling modifier, I would say, is another big one. And then the only other one that I would say is the levels of heading, I think, get people off guard a lot, especially if 1, you're not used to it, or 2, you're still kind of referencing an older manual. Once you get that straight, you should be fairly good to go.
The top 5 that I see in doctoral papers, anthropomorphism, number 1, easily, all the time. Pronouns without clear antecedents.
Yes.
So they or this, I'm like, what are you referring to? Especially when there are like 3 nouns in the previous sentence. I'm not sure which one you're doing. Or using a pronoun to start a new paragraph, which really forces you to go back to a previous paragraph. The we and us, see all the time. And most, I'd say 99.9% of the time, I have no idea who it's referring to. And actually, Natasha and I, we've had a conversation with this book we edited about how do we address that, because it was being handled different ways by different authors. M dashes, all the time. M dashes are not the same as hyphens and not the same as dashes. So read up on M dashes. And I think M dashes are way overused. If somebody uses them, they use it a lot. And then the other thing I see a lot, and I think this is a change from 6 to 7, is using the numeral for time. It's like when you write 5 days, you actually use the number 5 rather than writing in 5. I mean, I've had a lot of people say that's not correct. Like, well, yeah, here's the page number in the manual, because it just looks weird.
Yeah, those are good ones. And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, to go back to the we, so there's actually called editorial we in the manual. And so that's when you're using we as in like the general population, right? Like, so like we should care about this. And it's like, who's we? Academically, I don't know what we are talking
Right.
about, right? And so that's actually called editorial we. So the only time that you would use we is if you have literally spelled out who we
Yeah.
includes, and then you can use it. Otherwise, just really stick to the first person pronouns or the third person pronouns.
Actually, when I was reading Benny's paper this morning, he did that. He said, as a society, we, I'm like, yes, I know who he's talking about.
Natasha, what were you gonna say?
I was just going to add, we'll talk later in the week about sort of your writing process and things. But so some of the stuff as we were having this conversation, I was like, oh my gosh, I always do that. And there are certain things that I have to get through the writing, like get the ideas out. And then I know I need to go back and check for certain things in the writing after the fact. Like I overuse M dash in drafts. I'm like, M dash this, M dash that, M dash that. And so knowing those things that you do, that you need to go back and check and clean out, and some of it might be like checking for we's and all of those pieces, is also really helpful, because I tried to get it out of my writing process and it actually hurts my argument flow when I'm drafting. And so then I have this little list of things that I have to go back and I'm reading for and things. And so thinking too about like, don't try to tackle all of this at once, but think about where in the writing process you look for these things makes it also less overwhelming.
That's a really good point. Yeah, oftentimes you just start writing and then you can figure out all the other stuff later. Otherwise, you'll never get to writing.
There are things I still have to look up. I just cannot, for some reason, put them into my head. So I think what I've learned is knowing that it's something I have to check. So if you get into the practice of, yeah, I've got to check that, then you can go check it rather than just assuming there's nothing you have to change. So if you can just get into a practice saying, this is probably something I need to check, I still have to check numbers. I just cannot get that into my head. And so just knowing that, then you go back to your bookmarked section in your manual and then you look it up. But it's like learning another language, but the more you do it, the easier it is. And I agree with Casey, you do it now and it will save you a heck of a lot of time and money later on.
And the fact that you all have Heartful Editor as a resource already, like, again, I wish that we had that, but use them. Like, I don't know what the parameters are for you all to use Heartful Editor, but use it to the max as much as you can.
Yeah. And I wanted to mention that, so they aren't going to actually copy edit your paper, which is what a lot of our doctoral students ask them to do when they're done with their dissertation, is to do the copy editing. We're really using them more as a coach. But you can say, can you take a look at these and give me some feedback on my APA? And what they're going to do is what Casey said, they'll point that out a couple of times, but it's your responsibility to go back and make all those changes. And when I grade papers, I do the same thing. I'll note something a couple times, but I'm not going to do that through the entire paper. So it's your at this level, it's your responsibility to identify, once somebody's identified the patterns, for you to address those in that paper and then any subsequent papers. But I gave you the link you can directly submit a paper and get feedback electronically, or you can set up a meeting. You can either set up a phone meeting or even a video meeting to talk through some of this stuff. And that's a free resource to you all.
And I think Sarah still does webinars throughout. So I don't know, Gavin, if you get that information or what, but whenever, because those are free resources that she just offers through her editor. So if you're able to get on those, I think she goes into probably more detail of things that you might just want to learn if you're not already familiar with them.
Yeah, she did one last spring and like it sold out like in seconds. She did like 3 versions of it, but
yeah.
Any other questions? You probably have more once you get into them. And as Casey said, I wish our instructors knew APA better than they do. So there are going to be times when they're going to say something that's wrong. Feel free, and actually Casey did this to me. I can't remember what it was, but it was about including the first initial when there were same authors with same names. And I'm like, and I changed it on a paper, for one of our students, and Casey was the editor, and she said, no, that's not correct. I'm like, oh, good, now I know that. And so feel free to gently let instructors know, no, that's not correct. It's on page X in the manual or something like that. So back it up, but don't necessarily assume the instructors know APA. Some are much better than others. And some, I'll be honest, some of them won't even address it because they aren't comfortable or aren't as familiar with it.
I was just gonna say, I was today years old when I learned about the initial one, and I got the book, I looked it up, and I was like, oh, shoot.
Yeah, there actually, there were a few other things too I didn't know about today. So you learn new stuff all the time. But it takes practice.
Yes, and then you can't unlearn the things that you learn. So I read papers now, I'm like, oh, what is that? And it's not even written in APA, it doesn't even matter. I'm just like, oh, they missed the comma right there. They missed this right there. And you kind of just sort of catch on to those. It's like, oh, it's a dangling modifier. What are they talking about? Or, toward the end, when I was reading papers, exactly what Gavin was talking about, people just write this as the noun. And it's like, this what? So literally I would just start writing this what, just identifying for them because I don't know what you're talking about. Even though if you were to read it a little bit more, you probably could tell what it is. But when you're writing academically, you want to explain everything. So make sure it's this, make sure you tell them what this is that you're talking about.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Casey. I appreciate you giving us the overview. And then it is recorded, so I will stop recording now, but I will send you out